is going on.
All right, and we're here.
We're here.
So this will be, hopefully this will be not only just the first and the last, but hopefully this will be the second conversation that we have about this. If we want to take the idea of return to family seriously, I think we should return again for the for a second. But for everybody out there that's watching, I think this topic about family is very important. And I think we all have, everybody in this chat right now has had experiences with family, and there are real and tangible things to talk about. And perhaps maybe we can show the audience and you guys that there's aspects of philosophy, psychology, our own experiences that maybe we can reach something. Maybe we can think something more about family. I hope that the people watching this don't think that I don't think we're gonna come up with any answers today. So if you're watching for answers, I'm sorry, but I hope that everything we say will add to the richness of your question of what does it mean to return to my family. Um, so let's begin. I will start with Cadell's question because I think that is something very important. And Cadell, I'll let you take over for that one.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, this just sort of emerged sort of spontaneously between us. I think inspired by a conversation on your channel, Javier. And I think maybe in the intellectual spaces that we're a part of, family is an under-discussed topic, and it's not really connected, obviously, to a lot of intellectual conversations, and I think that's a little bit of a tragedy. I think in our own private email thread, the basic thing I was mostly joking about, but it's kind of, I mean, there is some truth to it, is like becoming a philosopher because of, I would say, like intimate troubles, or you could say trauma or negativity, or however you want to say it. There's a dimension to becoming an intellectual, in my experience, which has a very intimate ground or has a very intimate cause. Maybe that's the most general way to say it. And then in my experience, thinking about intellectualism and intimacy has been something that a lot of intellectuals find, I think, challenging to approach. Before I continue talking, though, I think I'm getting some feedback. So I don't know.
I hear a little bit of that, Cadell.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's on me or but not anymore. So, but yeah. So this relationship between the intellect and intimacy is something that I think is central to think about for us approaching the idea of family philosophically, and I think that this is incredibly important for us to do, just because what I was saying, that I think a lot of intellectuals, even in these meta-intellectual spaces, and in these meta-intellectual spaces, a lot of these spaces are thinking about the idea of building different communities, or the idea of building a different type of world. Like, for example, probably the most salient topic would be the emergence of this idea of game B, like this idea of another game. But oftentimes, I think that the issue of family and intimacy and the real of that dimension of our existence is just simply hidden, concealed, something that's talked around, and so forth. So before saying anything more, I guess one thing that I'll offer, I came up with basically an idea that I'm just wrapping my own head around, which is about my own intimate history. And it's this sort of dialectic between what I'd call transcendental categories and deconstructive categories. So I remember in the early years of my intimate history, with obviously I'm talking about with women and romantic life, I would operate with transcendental categories. So I had the idea of a girlfriend and I had an idea of a perfect girlfriend before I even met that girl. Or before I even met that woman, I had an idea of the perfect whatever, what I wanted. And then I would operate in the relationship with that transcendental category. And that would prove disastrous. Then, so you're not actually interacting with the person, you're interacting with the perfect category. Then I went into a mode of deconstructive categories. So I was basically saying, and this is something I'm only making sense of in retrospect, obviously, but I went into a mode of, okay, the perfect category is not working, so I'm just going to get rid of the categories. and then that doesn't work. That leads to a whole different type of experience, which I learned a lot from, but also not working. So basically what I'm thinking in my own personal life and what I'd offer for the discussion of intimacy, family, intellect, this type of thing is to have categories. We need categories, but those categories need to be derived from experience. So they're not transcendental categories. They're categories that emerge from your experience. And they're categories that aren't fixed, but constantly in relationship with new experience. And that means that you not only do you have to maintain your capacity as a thinker, but the challenge of maintaining your fidelity and your truthfulness as a thinker, the truthfulness of your rationality, is that you're constantly willing to think about your identity fundamentally transforming and with the other. And that doesn't mean, and I think that, like, before I stop, that doesn't mean in my head that long-term relationships are impossible. On the contrary, I think long-term relationships are possible on the condition that they are constantly capable of transforming themselves and developing with the other, and so that, and then what does that mean for family? So that's sort of, yeah, maybe where my head was at the start of this conversation.
Daniel? Yeah, go ahead, take it, man. I know you want to. You're muted, Daniel.
Oh, yeah, I was like, me? Really? Oh, gosh. Well, one, Dr. Last, outstanding. Wonderful framing. Absolutely. Javier, thank you for having us. This is a delight. Davood, Raven, your work at the STOA, the talks you had on pathological evolution, magnificent. Davood, book review, master, outstanding. I've enjoyed our conversation with John. I think, like you say, it's funny, right? Like, we all live in family. Family is something that we find ourselves in the moment that we're born, and we don't talk about it philosophically, except in some sort of vague ways. In different things. A little bit before Javier, we started this conversation, Javier sent that email, and I couldn't help thinking about all the different categories of people, how it relate to the family. Couldn't help but think about The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. And I think The Sound and the Fury might actually be an interesting framing. But of course I'm biased because, I'm introducing it. So maybe it's just my own imagination. But in the Sound of the Fury, you have this situation where you had Caddy Compson, who has, in the fates, what Faulkner wants to explore is how our ideals, transcendental categories, as Mr. Cadell Last mentioned, come in conflict with how we think the family is to be organized and how that is all centered around our ideals of sexuality. And if those ideas of sexuality are broken up, those can give us, it's almost like the Yeats poem. I think this kind of, where Yeats in The Second Coming, he says, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. The blood-tinted tide is loosened. And everywhere the ceremony of innocence is broken. In that part where he's like, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And you see this kind of embodied in The Sound of the Fury. But anyway, so Caddy loses her virginity outside the family. And in the South, the Compson family is fallen apart. There are ideals of, say, Southern honor, Southern values has been shown to be problematic. Walker, the Civil War has lost. And not only do you then lose your organizing principle, but it is also unveiled to you that organizing principle was oppressive, both to the two African Americans and also to the women in the situation. So you were organizing your life, and then it's like a double revolution. Revelation. You lose that organization, and you find out that you were participating in the present and the past. So that's very hard to take. And all three of the brothers in the Sound and the Fury represent a certain reaction to what we could call the loss of givens or the loss of transcendental categories, to follow like a Philip Reeve in the Triumph of the Therapeutic. So you have Benji, who's very important. And Benji is also going to represent how the family forms our associational mind. So Benji is mentally handicapped, and he operates according to a logic of association. So, for example, when he goes down to a golf course and somebody is shouting caddy, his sister is gone because he lost her virginity, was rejected from the family, but that's where he found kind of the meaning of his life. So every time he hears caddy, he's shot back to a memory of being with caddy. He's just there. There's no causality. It's all very associational, and he's just there. And so as you go through the chapter, he gets his outfit stuck on a fence, and then I think it's Lester is trying to let him go, and he's taken back to when Caddy tried to let him go. So time for Mr. Benji is associational. And the thing is that our family tends to be the main former of what could be called our associational mind. You'll be cooking and suddenly you're back with your mom when you were cooking when you were 4, or you'll suddenly be with your dad. And you're almost like always here, but you're always there as well. Kind of like you're in 2 streams of time at the same time. And the family have a very profound formation on the time that you were always in, even though you were not in it. That's why it can be especially problematic if you have a traumatic experience in family, because you're always kind of trapped like Benji going back through that. And you didn't ask to be put in that situation either. Just by the fact of being born, that's how it's going to kind of form your mind. So, Benji represents this kind of time that you're stuck in with your family. And then when the center of that is lost, Quentin and Jason are then going to represent responses to that, where Quentin is kind of intellectual. He's kind of the philosopher. He goes off to Harvard. And he's trying to find a rational understanding or an intellectual solution to this loss of givens, or being stuck in this sort of time of knowing Caddy is gone and not being able to escape the fact that your transcendental categories no longer work. And unfortunately, he ends up committing suicide. It doesn't work so well. Where Jason gets very angry, and he kind of represents the devil, where he's just mad, and he's always mad at Caddy, and he's always mad at the family. And you could see that Jason kind of represents maybe the turn to fascism or the turn to totalitarianism that you see today, as you are losing the organizing principles of society, where people want to get back to nostalgia. They're just kind of mad. Where Quentin wants to come up with a solution to how to fix things, but he cannot do it. So you could see maybe in Quentin more of the progressive sort of utopia. We'll make something better, but you can't do it and it all falls apart. Where Quentin is nostalgic and he wants to, like, he's like, well, everything would have been fine if it wasn't for that stupid Caddy. If we could have just fixed her, then the family would be all together. Both of those are bad responses. And that's where you get the sound and fury, the tale told by an idiot strutting across the stage and so on and so forth. And all of these also, as I'll bring up later, and then pass it to Michelle, to whoever wants to take it, are all talking about how our connection with time and our connection with family, like how we relate to time, how we experience time, are very close together. The final character who Faulkner seemingly suggests is who we all need to be like is Dilsey, who is the servant of the family. And he refers to Dilsey as enduring, where she's in the space, such as, say, today, where traditional family structures don't work as well, or we're thinking that they could be oppressive. We're trying to find a way to keep the good of it, but also not just leave it there, because there could be some problems. How do you update it without abandoning it? But she's in this space. It's Easter in her section. So, the second coming, resurrection. But she's in the space of enduring, waiting for what could come next, because there is no solution yet to what needs to happen. And it's the space where it could be a Hegelian negation. You've lost the past, but now it makes space for a potential sublimation of something new. Or it could just be an effacement, where you've lost the past and you don't know what you're going to replace it with, and everything kind of falls apart. And so Dilsey leaves us this question, where we are trying to endure in a certain situation, where we're trying to figure out a new kind of guiding principle or way to do the family that doesn't demonize the past family, which would be what Jason does, nor does it try to intellectualize a solution to family that doesn't take the tradition seriously, say what a Quentin does. And the reason we are motivated to do this is because we are stuck in a sort of associational time, like Benji is. We can't help but do that. And we are in the state now of Dilsey, where we're trying to endure, and in that space on Easter Day, per se, have the possibility of a new sublimation. So I think it's an important topic. I will pass it on, and I think if not discussing it then is not the answer, because you're going to either turn into a Quentin or a Jason, basically. Either anger or hopelessness or despair will come in. And so by taking it on, incorporating all these different topics, I think it is necessary for the endurance to make space for something more, as opposed to end up a effacement that could be problematic.
I'll hop in here really quick and just say that I think that's interesting that the character that Faulkner maybe presents as like a possible solution would be the servant.
Yes.
Because I was looking at the etymology of the word family, and it's actually some of its earliest ties and earliest origins had to do with actually a group of servants. So I think there's something very interesting about how it's in the place of service that family does seem to emerge. And Cadell, I like that you brought it back to like very personal experiences with women, or like with romance and relationships, because like that's where families come from, right? Like people fall in love, and then they like have babies, and then they have make family. They decide to do this, and so I think like we it's interesting, because as we kind of like have our own maturation and own sense of self and sexuality, that's where we kind of start to think about like family even more. And that's sometimes too one of the places of our times of our lives where we maybe feel even more tension with family, because you're kind of coming into your own self, and so there can be the butting of heads with mother, father, or with these ideals of how you should be, or what you should pursue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, so I think it is really important, because I think you cannot discuss family without discussing sexuality. You cannot discuss family without discussing romance. That's and right. Like your interest in the other, and this desire, this like really deep desire. But I think what's interesting, because even there's a type of serving, there's this interesting idea of the serving being also gratification. And so I think that the serving character for Faulkner, I think is I can understand why that could possibly be some sort of solution, or at least like a
space of the possibility,
a space for the possibility. If we think about serving yourself too, because if it obviously, like, part of the fact that this family these ideals and transcendentals was deconstructed was right. Because it's almost like where the two meet, right? Like Cadell, you said like the transcendent and the deconstructive, right? Well, there's like, it's like it kind of had this explosion in the sound and the fury, right? And it's like that. I think that that's where service can become the obligatory, all of the things that can be negative and bad. But if we think about like service in terms of also this very interesting, almost symbiotic, like if I think biologically, ecologically, kind of serving the other ends up being serving yourself. I think that kind of helps at least provide a space for talking about some potential, potential there. So I did just want to comment that so far.
Raven?
Yeah, I feel like what the two of you just said was, I have the perfect anecdote to bring out all of that. I just spent a week with she's almost 92, my grandmother. She was recently just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So she is now integrating and accepting that she is leaving the world. And my grandmother has been holding on to death. Like, she's like just never wanted to die. She never accepted that she was old. She's like always been in control. She's like this very independent, very like powerful matriarchal figure who's definitely been very tyrannical and oppressive, but also a center of gravity and a glue that's held the family together. And I just spent this last week with her, and it was exactly like you described. I came as the servant. I came as the servant to serve her, to care for her. And it was one of them. I was surprised. I was surprised by how much I deeply enjoyed living at her pace of life, taking myself out, like my pace, my energy, my youthfulness, my concerns, my immediacy, and instead extending my pace of life into hers, which is extremely different than mine. Seeing her space, seeing her home from her perspective instead of mine, because that's what the caregiver has to do. I have to think about how she's navigating the world so that I can care for her. And this has been, as I've been reflecting on this has awakened so much of this associative time for me, where I feel like I'm living in multiple different times. I feel like I'm living in my future, where I'm serving my future unborn children through this. And I'm serving my past. I'm serving my history with my grandmother. My mother also passed away when I was 19. So I'm serving my mother. I'm serving things I don't even understand or know, my grandmother and her experience of her mother's death, and also the future of my lineage when I'm old and I'm surrounded by my grandchildren, my great grandchildren, and it's all happening at once. And I feel like there's something interesting about connecting to this kind of like my feminine sexuality, or my feminine kind of fertility and nature, the center of my body. It's like standing on the edge of the void and embracing this associative time, and embracing that it's going to come as a kind of um, as a vision. I had all of these visions towards the end of the week. I had all of these visions come up about like what I needed to do, what my role was, how I needed to reorganize my life in order to serve my grandmother, the depth of that significance. And I was just opening myself up to these images and to these visions, and they were so emotionally like potent in this way that went deep into my root. And I think that is there's also the element of my family in terms of the particular dynamics. Is like my mother was supposed to be my grandmother's heir, but she died. And so, and my brother and I are not quite old enough. We're not, we haven't really earned her her respect quite yet, because we're like very bohemian, and like I'm the child of the black sheep of the family, and like we're all very strange, and like, but there's this palpable feeling that I'm getting when I'm like, now that I'm around my grandmother, and she's taking visits, she's closing her affairs, she's starting to figure out where she wants to take the last aspects of her energy that she's had on this earth. Where is she going to channel it? She's very resistant to giving it to my aunt, who never really earned her respect, honestly, which is another aspect of like conflict in the family, when certain family members don't actually rise to the expectations of the most powerful figures. Those powerful figures then end up being kind of tyrannical, and they don't want to share the things that they've earned in their lives, and then they want to control other people, right? And that's been the dynamic in my family. But this care, this serving, I feel like is the opening. It's not a guarantee that my grandmother will see me as the inheritor, but it is an opening that by taking on this role of service, by taking on this role of care, that I'm giving her the opportunity to choose someone to channel her energy into. And that's built fundamentally on trust, that I'm empathizing with her. Like, honestly, kind of in the most deep way that I have in my whole life, in a way that I'm like seeing past the things that she's hidden. Because that's the other thing about these, especially older adults. Like my grandmother was well into her adulthood when I was born. And so there's a mysteriousness of the grandmother, of the grandfather. You don't really fully understand the depth of their experience until you become an adult yourself. And even then, I'm lucky to get the chance at 26 to face my grandmother, because I wasn't able to see her the same way when I was 20. And I probably would see her very differently if I could see her as 30, but I that's not going to happen. And so just like trying to embrace as much knowledge of her as I possibly can by letting go of my immediate concerns and tapping into what she's facing right now is the opening. It's the opening for restructuring the family. It's the opening for creating a new route. And like I said, there's no guarantee that it will happen, but it is where I see the possibility of growth and emergence rather than decay and entropy. So I thought that was interesting, all of the things that you said. It's like, wow, it really fits in to the palpable, just visceral experience. And I think the other thing too is over the last, I don't know, few years, especially since COVID hit, I've just been getting the like, oh my God, I need to have a baby kind of craving. And the situation, I think, is very interesting. I had this thought yesterday. I was like, oh, my grandmother is my baby. My grandmother is my baby. My grandmother is my baby. I was like, oh my God, my grandmother is my baby. Holy shit. Like, I'm not ready to have a baby right now. I'm not ready, but I can channel this desire to care for someone who's dependent into my 92-year-old grandmother who's dying, and develop my maternal care. And I think that that's something that I hadn't really thought about, which is like, as a woman, making sure that I'm taking on these responsibilities of maternal care as I'm becoming an adult. Because if I was to skip this, if I wasn't to live or to deeply take this drive and develop it, I think I would lose this opportunity to deepen my experience, you know. And the fact that my grandmother is here and I can take my time and I can give this attention and love and care for her in a kind of total way, I get to develop my, like, this goes back to what you were saying, Michelle, about caring is for you. You know, it's for my grandmother, but it's also for me. And they're happening simultaneously. It's a totally intersubjective situation. And it's not even just the two of us. It's not even just dyadic. It's like my grandmother is becoming the baby again. She is going through the process of life where you go to your deathbed and you're almost infantile. And there's something beautiful about that. There's something beautiful about being cared for and being bathed and being fed and being given all of this love and returning to that place of the womb and being inside of this like soft container where none of the hard parts of life are any of your concern, and you can just be in your history and your life, everything that's personal to you, and go back to that. So she's returning to the state of the infant. And then, like I said before, in this terms of this time thing, I am doing this for my future children. And this type of time is very difficult to fit into normal day-to-day life. Like, especially in our society where time has been understood in this regimented linear way, when in fact the actual experience of time and memory and family is associative. It's not linear. And my last week with my grandma, oh my God, I mean, it felt so long, right? Like, time dilation is also this other thing. Like, she could live for another 3 months, but that might feel like a year for both of us. And just this whole expansive amount of time because of how rich it is. And so there's something here in terms of like the way that we frame time and the way that we are so fixated on these external transcendental structures in order to orient ourselves. The gravitational pull of our social world is such that it completely pushes all of this into the shadows. And a lot of people are just choosing to continue to stay in relation to these structures rather than to go into their families and take on the family time. Understandably so, right? It's really difficult. It's like, you know, it's a huge act, and it's only possible in certain specific contexts. And you have to just be willing to jump in this leap of faith. And I don't know that there's like a lot of room for that. But the thing of it is, it's like, if you miss it, you don't know, because it's operating on so many different layers of time. You have no idea what you're tinkering with by not going through that door. So thank you for bringing that out of me. That was amazing.
Davood, I'm just going to do this systematically because I think a lot of people.
Thank you. Thanks, Javier, for organizing this. It's really great to be here with you, Cadell, Raven, and O.G Rose, Daniel, and Michelle. I enjoyed listening to you so far. I don't know if I have anything to add I just want to say that for me, family is something that is very difficult to talk about. Throughout my life, my education, formal, informal, there are certain things that I kind of learned to talk about, to interact with conceptually. Family is not one of those, even though family is extremely important. And I think I'm representative of a broader, a kind of person. Talking about family is difficult. So I think that also is captured in the title of our discussion, returning to family. So we know that we must have come out of families, but at some point there is this need for return, and return indicates that we have been separated. And who wants to return to the family? So to start asking the question of family, or to consider the problem of family, if there is a question for us, if there is a central question, we can call the question of family. It could be, who is it for whom family has become an issue? Is it a philosopher who is deep at work and suddenly he feels a tug at his sleeve, and there's a child, his child or her child wants the attention of this philosopher, and now the philosopher says, damn, I need to pay attention to my family, I need some family time too. Is that the kind of interruption that that philosophy is getting from family? Or is it maybe the philosopher has done the work and then later she's thinking about her children? Said, okay, I've learned a lot. I've accumulated a lot. Now I'm thinking about my family. My return to family is, how can I best teach my children? That could be one way. I think there are many different ways of thinking about family being interrupted by problems of family at different times. And I think the time at which family becomes a question, and what position we are at, and part of what we can do to serve, that theme of service also resonates a lot with me. Showing up with the attitude of service, asking, what can I do? And what is this thing? And paying attention to the times of the question and what positions we are at when this becomes a problem. I think for me helps clarify, because I admit that I cannot, family is one of those things that I cannot understand. I cannot fully understand it. I cannot say this is, family is incorporated into my conceptual system. At best, I can participate in a family, and decisions that we make with respect to our families are always decisions that we cannot fully anticipate the consequences of. I can say, this is how I want to serve, but I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what the other person is going to say. And family members always surprise us. Even though we make our decisions we might make our decisions very considerately, very thoughtfully, but the response that we receive is always potentially surprising. Yeah, I'll stop there and return to Javier. Just
I think you guys really nailed some beautiful things there, because with the accumulation that you guys have been saying, it's a story that I always talk about, right? Like, how did I become closer to my father, right? And it goes back to what Cadell had said, right? The transcendental categories. How do you not do that and then match it up with your real experience? And I did it by separating. Like, I cut off the category of father, and I decided to get to know my father as a person rather than a father. And that completely changed my experience. Now I can reattach the category father. And what I think is interesting is that we use the terms father and mother, but I think it's very important, the way Cadell brought it up, is that we want to attach our experience. So when you say father, you want to attach the experience of my father, not anything else. The experience of my father. But also at the same time, because it reminds me of the talk that me and Davood had, there's this aspect of you want to keep sacred the idea of motherhood and fatherhood as well. I hope that makes sense for the people that are listening, because it could be that when I actually reattach the category to my actual father, he still doesn't quite represent what fatherhood means. And so perhaps for those, that if for those of us that are struggling with that, the real question is, well, I have to live with that question, honestly. I have to live with the idea of like, what does a father really mean? Because I never really had a father. And I have to live with that. But there is an opening, like Raven said. And I also had, and the reason why this whole event got started, because I was with my family, and I thought to myself, I can't just talk philosophical concepts and just not talk about tangible things. It just, everything feels so cold when I don't talk about intimate things anymore. And so I realized that if you want to really know somebody, to know your family member, to know your father, there's an aspect of what everybody pointed out. You have to be in their language. Be in their language. And if, for those that are listening, maybe don't know what I'm talking about, Raven gave a big clue, right? Being with her grandmother, supporting her, caring for her. There's a language being built in there, and then she's also living in it. So it's like the time is completely different. But to give another example, I visited my uncle recently, and he said, "Do you want to see my plants?" And I'll tell you right now, I don't care about plants. I could care less about plants. But here's the thing that I learned as I've been getting older, is that my uncle really wanted me to show, he really wanted to show me his plants, his garden, the things that he's been working on. And I said, yeah, yeah, show me. And he spent like probably 10 minutes talking about every specific plant that he has growing there, right? And the funny thing is, I wasn't even upset, because what it was this unsayable experience about, this is my uncle. This is my uncle. This is my uncle. This is how I get to know my uncle. I have to learn about radishes, But and then the other thing is also with my mother. It's the same thing. My mom says, do you want to go on a walk with me? No, I don't want to go on a walk. I hate walking. And the funny thing about my mother is that she wants to do 6 miles. It's not just like a walk. She wants to do a 6-mile walk. Okay. And I'm like, but I said, yeah, I'll go on a walk with you, Mom. So I go on a walk with my mom. And I'll tell you right now, it was probably the best conversation I've ever had with my mom, the whole 6 miles. It didn't even feel like 6 miles. It's because, again, I am deciding to give into her language, whether it be actions or words. And the same thing with my father, right? He always talks stocks and movies. And I always felt like that was very cold of him. Like, I was like, why isn't my father a deep thinker? But that's the thing. And this is what I've always been saying to so many people, is that you want to protect difference. And in order to protect difference, you immerse yourself in their language. Now, for those of you that are listening, I hope there's no guarantee that they will immerse themselves in your language. That is the not guarantee. And let me tell you, it rarely happens. It rarely happens. So I would suggest just give it up right away. But if you really want this idea of how to know your family and love your family, then you have to immerse yourself in the language. Of course, there's context to everything. Not everybody's language is safe. Not everybody's language is welcoming. So I would like to add that part, because, I have the opposite experience with my grandfather, who's also sick. He has Parkinson's. And in fact, every time my mother tries to take care of him, he's like aggressive. He's spitting, he's fighting back. I remember my mom was like, oh, he doesn't want us to shave him. And I said, do you have to shave him? She's like, no, but he just looks nice. And I said, but do you have to shave him? She's like, no. And I was like, well, I would punch you too if you were trying to shave me. And like, I don't need to, it's like, there's this aspect of like, my mom wants to, like, my family wants to take care of my grandfather, but they're not immersing themselves in his language. And a part of it is actually because they can't accept that he's going to die eventually. They can't accept it because actually my mom not being able to shave him is actually a big sign that he's ready to let go. Right. So it's actually not, there's that very subtle difference of like, are you enforcing your language onto the other? Or are you really immersing yourself in the other's language? And I hope that makes a very critical distinction because, it's very difficult to be like, oh, well, he's harming himself by not letting us take care of him. Maybe. But then also at the same time, it also could be the fact that you just can't let go. And that is also just as difficult. So I will do the same sequence and I will go back to Cadell.
Okay. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, just thank you guys. Yeah, just first off, gratitude for this space and for this conversation. And it's so important. I always feel like if I feel like my voice is starting to shake, it's a good thing, like it's because it's like, I feel like this is the space that's where something really salient is emerging. And it's kind of like something David Bowie said about learning when he said, you don't want to be on the beach and you don't want to be in the middle of the ocean. You want to sort of be with your head just above the water with your feet touching the sand. And so, you want to be in that kind of space. And that's where I feel like my voice starts to shake. So this is a nice space to be. So I'm going to try to structure my speech in a Hegelian circle. So I'm going to start with something and I'm going to end with something with a negative point of reference. So Daniel said we must discuss the negativity of the family in order to save it. And I think we have to start with the negativity. We have to start with the abyssal nature of identity. And we have to be able to confront that with our speech. It's important that we talk about it. And so I really strongly agree with Daniel's starting point there. And then Javier was talking about something that I started with as well, which was that there's this problem of philosophical concepts being divided from intimate things. And this is fundamentally problematic. I think that when we have philosophical concepts divided from intimate things, we actually have forgotten how philosophical concepts are derived. Because I think philosophical concepts are derived from intimate things. And then philosophers don't understand how the concepts were derived, and then we end up not talking about intimate things. Because if you start talking about intimate things, you're going to break the foundation upon which the philosophical concepts emerged in the first place. So it's kind of like this concealed origin of philosophy itself, in some senses, and is in talking about intimate things, I think. And practically speaking, I think this gets us into the problem that Javier mentioned about immersing yourself in the other's language. When it comes to something Daniel and I have discussed in the philosophy of lack as explanation versus address. I think when you have a situation where philosophical concepts are divided from intimacy, you have a society where everyone is explaining things to everyone else, but no one is addressing an other person. So we're no longer addressing each other. So I think we have to build the spaces, which I think this is an example of such a space, where explanation is couched in address. Like Javier said this, I'm going to respond to him. Daniel said this, I'm going to respond to that directly. And so that we have a culture where where it's not just explanation. We are addressing the other. And the point of the explanation is for the other in a relationship with the other, where hopefully, unfortunately, we have families where we have to give ourselves to the other and the other won't give themselves back to us. Ideally, we have a culture where we are giving, and that's what Michelle was talking about with a group of servants. And the origin of the family is in a group of servants, where ideally we're in a situation where and there is an asymmetry of responsibility here for the older members of the family in some sense, as it relates to obviously children. so that requires a certain responsibility of adults. I remember this was something profound for me, is you cannot blame a child for not understanding an adult, but you can blame an adult for not understanding a child. There's this great scene in Matilda, the movie Matilda, where there's this horrible principal. I don't know if you guys know. Is it Matilda? Yeah, I think it's Matilda, where there's this horrible principal. She's like basically tortures the kids. And I remember there's this funny line that the principal says, where she says, "Oh, I can't stand children. I'm glad I never was one." But it's obviously a joke, but it's perfect, right? Because there are so many adults who don't realize what it's like. They don't remember what it was like to be a kid and to go through that. And that's so important for these asymmetrical relationships between older people and younger people. I think a perfect example of how it's done right is if you study the way Dumbledore relates to Harry Potter throughout the Harry Potter series, that is a perfect adult. He is unbelievable with Harry throughout the entire series. And there's so much that goes into the depth of character that Dumbledore had to be in order to be that type of elder, right? Because he has to be he has to be, like Raven was talking about, this mysterious depth of experience that Harry could never possibly fathom. And there must come such a pain with that. That there's so much you can't say. There's so much you can't capture. But there's one other thing I wanted to say about the origin of family that Michelle was talking about. There's a paradox here with the origin of family, that it's a group of servants, and it emerges from sexual desire fundamentally. And so usually we attach sexual desire with something that's very selfish. That's my sexual desire. Like that I have this passion, I have this need, or I have this desire. And then from that immediacy, which is selfish, there emerges a group of servants, possibly. And I think that there's a line here from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Nietzsche's talking about, we once called the passions evil, now I only have virtue. Grew out of my passions, implanted higher aims in the heart of passions, then became the virtues and joys. Originally hot-tempered, voluptuous, fanatical, vindictive, all passions turned virtues, devils turned angels, dogs in the cellar, blast into birds and charming songs, poisons brewed balsams, drinking milk of her udder, nothing evil grew any longer, only evil that grew out of conflict was virtues. I think this captures this relationship where if we actually confront our deepest passions, and we're not afraid of ourselves, we're not afraid of our deepest passion, that the only thing we have to fear in confronting our deepest passions is the growth of our own virtue. And the problem, I think, it's basically a developmental understanding of religion. Because the problem with religion is often they try to jump to the virtue without going through the passions. And so so the individual isn't included within the whole process. And I've seen this is fundamentally why people start to distrust religion and start to turn on religion, because there's no room for the development of the passions. So I think that's something. And here we have a Nietzsche, I'm quoting Nietzsche, who's saying God is dead. I don't think fundamentally here we have a character who's against cultivating the highest virtues and things like this. So it's interesting to think about that. And then two more points before I pass it on, because I wanted to sort of address what I loved in everyone's speech is I think it's so important to talk about what I think is reflected in Raven's speech as it relates to, we are the type of beings which conceptually hold the total past and the total future in the present. And that's very strange that we're that type of being. And there's a huge responsibility with being a type of being that holds the total past and the total future in the present. And that's a very weird temporality, because it's not like an objective past and an objective future. It's the past and the future from the standpoint of the present. And it's in this particular singular experience, like caring for my grandmother. I had the same experience when I was caring for my grandfather. I was at the very origin of things, and I was at the total past and the total future of my whole family structure. And that comes with a huge responsibility. And you grow in the depth of your character if you can be in this type of reality where basically your linear identity is going to fragment and break down. But you are the type of being that can do that and can be that. And then finally, I think something incredible that Davood said, which was, the family is something that cannot be conceptualized as an all. This is crucial. The family is not, when you reach intimate space, I would say this is applied to intimate space. And I think this is like technically precise. Intimate space is something which cannot be conceptualized as an all. And so this is where reason disconnected from the body, or reason disconnected from truth, breaks down. Because reason disconnected from the body and reason disconnected from truth wants to make everything an all. But the family and the intimate space is where it can't do that. So the crucial thing here is thinking about how our reason has to be in service of the crack in the all. Reason has to be in service of where the all doesn't make sense. Reason has to be in service of the place where you can't think everything all together and it doesn't all make sense. You're disoriented. It's confusing. You're in service of the other. And the reason why it's like that is because there are others. So it has to be like that. If it was all, then you would be the only one. So so the reason why that brings everything full circle to me is because it starts in the negativity. So where Daniel says we have to be able to think the negativity, we have to be able to think the crack. And that's where I'll end.
Magnificent, everyone. My goodness, Dr. La, everyone, Davood, Raven, magnificent. And I have flashbacks to the part in Matilda where he's forced to eat the second cake. The guy's up there, he eats the whole cake because he wants to eat cake, and the teacher makes him another, and he gets through it. It was a terrifying scene. So I remember Matilda quite well. There's a bunch of things. So there's this notion of the idea that has to come back to the actual, to the lived experience. And there's something about, I think, phenomenology that was trying to do that, but then it became from the experience to the experience, where it was a bracketing out of the subject, like in Husserl, like experience to experiments. But then you could have empiricism, hard empiricism, that is the object of experience to itself without the subject, right? So both of those is an AA. And as we've talked about before, if you get to an AA, there's no difference. And if there's no difference, there's no thing. And so there's an effacement. So you want to get to something like an AB, as we've talked about before. I love the thing that you talk about, Dr. Last, on the idea in Hegel. You have the, you have the abstraction, and you have the negation, and you have the concretion, the making concrete. And there's this really funny sense that you don't even have a real idea until you try to realize it into the concrete. Like, for example, you have the idea of the entrepreneurship you're going to start. I'm going to make the best banana ice cream anyone's ever made. These idiots down at the local place, they don't know how to make banana ice cream. I'm going to do it, man. So you take this abstract idea and then you negate its abstraction into actuality. Okay. And then you go, oh my gosh, it's really hard to make freaking banana ice cream. I thought it was easy. And then you find out that you never actually had an idea. You thought you did, but then when you brought it to the concrete, you're like, I'm a freaking retard. And so, you realize that the idea that you thought was an idea was not even an idea, and you don't even get there. I think phenomenology was trying to get there. I think someone in phenomenology, perception, whatever. But what's really interesting is that in Hegel, who's always ahead of us, I'm just convinced of this, there's a pragmatism there, but it's a kind of metaphysical pragmatism where it's taking the subject seriously. I almost want to call it, it's actually after our talk, I had I want to talk about phenomenological pragmatism, because also the fantastic Zach Stein brought up Bryson. He was talking about the spirit of trust. And I want to bring that all together, but I'm not going to do that because it's really tempting, but there's something where they all connect in very important ways. But basically, if philosophy doesn't return to the concrete or return to the family or so on and so forth, then the idea is to the idea. So that's an AA, and then it's completely it's effaced. Whereas if it stays in the practical and it's just the practical and you don't take ideas into consideration, well, that's an effacement as well, because here's the funny thing about pragmatism as such. All pragmatism must be defined as practical relative to your ideas of what are the practical. So you never escape ideas. The problem is when you say I'm a practical person, I'm not an idea person, you end up embodying probably an ideology or capitalism or whatever the zeitgeist is and not even realize you're doing it. So you have to think about it, or you end up participating in something you don't know what you're participating in. Those are all thoughts. There's a bunch of things because you wonderful people bring up so many wonderful things. You know, one of the things our understanding of family is extraordinarily tied to our experience of time. And as in the past, now all of this is general. Everything I'm saying is general. There are always exceptions, so on and so forth. The map is not the territory. And I love what you said, Dr. Last, because indeed reasoning begins precisely at the point where the map doesn't equal the territory. And then with the girdle incompleteness, so on and so forth. Generally speaking, people's family roles and gender roles were a response to the facticity of the world before, say, the 1950s. Big generality. Someone will hear that and say, no, it was 1942. Okay, yes, I don't have the precise idea. But generally, most work for human history was manual. Most of it until like the 1950s. So the male did the work. There was no formula. There was no birth control until basically the 1950s. So the woman would generally stay at the house. And also the house did not have electric heating. It did not have, there was so much work. I really, like, it's pretty freaking crazy how much work the family took, the house took to take care of things. And then the male had to go cut down the trees and do all these different things. So here's the key. The gender roles and the family roles, because those things always go together because sex is tied to that, were more of a response to the world, right? Well, as a result, here's the thing. As of 1950s, generally, where there's white collar work, there's more white collar work, there's more birth, so on and so forth. Well, now the categories, the response is not given to you. So now you have to choose them. You have to decide what they are. Oh, crap, because now that's existential. Now that's psychological. Who gets to decide what they are? Why do you get to decide those? Why can't we negotiate? All liberation is always existential. Liberation is always psychological. And so now, whenever you have a space of increased freedom, you also have a space of increased pressure, right? Because whereas before you could say, oh, well, the man's doing the work because, yeah, most work is, you know, Orwell's Wiggum and Pear or something like that. You're going and doing, and the woman is taking care of the child because they don't have formula. You would say it wasn't like the male was telling the woman to stay at home. I know there were instances, of course, say in the Everest we can follow Foucault, the history of sexuality, so on and so forth. There were instances of that, but generally there was a lot of response to the world. Well, now that you're choosing it and now that you're picking it, well, why should you get to pick it and not this person? Why should you choose that instead of that? And there's a lot of the negativity space, right? And so all negativity spaces also are increase of possibility, but very importantly, possibility is very difficult because you have to then decide on it. And so there are two responses to that. I'm going to go back to the Sound and Fury. There tends to be a few responses to that increased possibility. I wish we could just get back to the way things were, you know, Jason, or trying to go back to the past, or kind of despair because you're trying to think of a new. So a few more things in the Sound and the Fury, because I think that's a really important book for this conversation. Benji, who represents the associational time, the Kairos moment, and all time at the same time, he's a kind of solution to the problem of the other, because he's in all time. He genuinely experiences Caddy as present, right? But then he's back in the moment and he's gone. So he oscillates between kind of a despair and a paradisio, if you will, right? But you see, Benji is kind of childlike. He almost represents a return to the womb. So he's a solution if you can return to the womb, right? Kind of Freud. But of course, you cannot do that. And so if you do that, you destroy society, right? Like Benji precisely has this kind of experience in all time at the same time, precisely because he's not fully developed. Mentally, he's gone through an incident. So there's a temptation to not fully develop as people when faced with the situation, so we can remain in a child state. But the problem is, although we all want to be childlike, we do not want to be childish, right? So you want to maintain a childlike. So Benji's the childish, even though there's a solution there. In Quentin, there's this really important line where the father tells Quentin something like, time does not begin until the clock stops. Until the hands of the clock stop ticking, there is no time. which of course alludes, because all of this is going to get into, I just finished, I really enjoyed the section in Mr. Bard's Global Empire, where he's talking about mobilism, eternalism. It's kind of the middle of the global empire. But of course, he talks about the individual instead of the individual. He talks about hyper time instead of clock time. All of these are going to be components where, here's the thing. Before the 1950s, if you had a bad concept of space-time or the individual, whatever, you could kind of get away with it because you were responding to the world. So having the wrong ideas, you were working so much or just taking care of things that having the wrong conceptual construct, it was kind of hidden. But now that you have to choose, not having, because I think all of this fits into Hegel's absolute knowing, as Dr. Last can correct me on, now you basically have to have absolute knowing. And we haven't really done much to get ourselves ready for that. And things are going. And so, what's that, Dr. Last?
So there is a course where, well, just
yeah. No, everyone, if you have not gone through Dr. Last's YouTube channel, you are missing out. And the worst thing is you don't even know what you're missing out on. That's the worst part. So if you miss out, you don't even know you miss out. But so there's this state where there's kind of a call for a state of absolute knowing, which entails a perpetual reconstitution. Right? There's kind of a reconstitution in A equals B as opposed to an AA effacement. And I think what Javier was saying on the on where you're really putting yourself into your uncle, we did a paper called Critical Thinking, where basically we want to say that critical thinking is the act of empathy, and where empathy is not merely is the act of thinking, truly thinking through an entirely different worldview or way of thinking than yourself. Like you don't do empathy if you put your shoes in another person's shoes. You have to put your feet in another person's feet. But that means you have to literally, like the most salient example of when you're doing that is when you're doing something you don't want to do. Just like Javier was saying, like you don't want to talk about the plants, but you do it anyway. That is when you can get the AB. That's when you can get the individual, as Mr. Bard talks about, right? That's when you can get the individual, as opposed to the individual. You need to get the individual, but that means your will has to be open. There's a radical openness, of which is by definition incredibly pathological and difficult to do, right? Especially if you're like Mr. Bard warns, like you're in capitalism, you're the individual, what you want is God, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you also have to be comfortable with a different notion of time. As we were describing that the Sound of the Fury emphasizes. The other things I want to pick up, and then I'll pass it on to, I guess, Michelle. Hey, so Quentin, there's this other part where the father, I think it's at the beginning, where the father says something to Quentin where he says, he's giving him a clock, like a watch. He's handed to Quentin. He says something like, I give you this, not so that you can remember time, but that's so you can forget it every now and then and not spend every breath fighting it. Because there is no victory in this life. The battlefield simply reveals the despair and foolishness. Victory is an illusion of philosophers and fools. So there's this notion that what he wants Quentin to do is to kind of forget time, right? To kind of forget it every now and then, and to have victory over time, because time is the main kind of thing in The Sound and the Fury. Is there's this idea that you can't do it. You can only have these glimmers where you kind of forget. In the same way that Benji has these glimmers of seeing Caddy again, who's like kind of these glimmers. But you see, what's quite funny is that Quentin fights this by trying to reestablish order, like kind of an order in his life. Because that's the rational mind. Let me just order the modern world. And if I can get the right ideas in the right order, everything's going to go together. And that's precisely the moment when Quentin gets himself together and in order. That's when he commits suicide. So there's another thing that there's a temptation to think for the intellectual that if you can just get the right ideas in the right order, you're going to kind of return. That's going to fix everything. But that's not the answer. It's in fact, because that's just an AA. That's just an escape. What it will come down to is, in fact, doing the sort of practices that Javier is talking about. But of course, here's a reason, though, why we can resist that. Very importantly, the Compson family and frickin' Sound and the Fury is, in fact, totalitarian and oppressive. They are contributing to slavery. People suffer trauma in families. Families do terrible things to people. There is very good reason why people don't want anything to do with a lot of their families. And yet, what freaking Faulkner is suggesting is that we have to endure this space where we accept the shortcomings of families and precisely the trauma that it can cause, to figure out a way to return to it in terms of, if we use Mr. Bard's term, hypertime individual, in terms of an understanding of a new time of absolute knowing. Because if we do not, then we're simply dealing with the deconstruction categories. We're not finding an AB between the transcendental and the deconstruction. And that's when we get all the freaking trouble. So we have to have this kind of return to the family, because again, and the last thing I'll say, when you listen to people's trauma stories, which is very interesting on with families are different, they talk about, like, for example, the teacher tells them that they did a really good job at home, at school on the test, and they come home and they tell mom, and mom's like, I guess. And there's kind of always this dismissal. And eventually what ends up happening is kids like, well, maybe I didn't do a good job. What's critical is, like in trauma, the very ability of people to identify reality is gone. Like they're not even able to trust their understanding of situations, right? So when the family is screwed up, it destabilizes their ability to understand and trust reality, and it destabilizes their sense of memory and thus time and different things. So it's absolutely the case, and then I'll pass it on to Michelle, that if we want a society that's going to be more individual and more hypertime, ergo absolute knowing, it does indeed have a lot to do with the family, because the family is the foundation. It's kind of the beginning of where one's ability to understand the world around them is organized and structured. So all of those things go together. Our orientation to space and time is incredibly functioned, organized by the family.
Guys, you make it very hard for me. Like so many notes.
She's got like 30 notes, guys. This is
so
great. I got
notes.
30.
It's ridiculous. But no, thank you all so much for what you shared. And I guess I just want to kind of bring it back a bit to this idea of language. And I think this will tie in though well, Daniel, to what you just said about how we cannot overlook the trauma space that can be the family, because it's so formative, right? For good and for bad, right? For good or for bad, it depends. But it's such a formative place, and I think that because that can't be overlooked, we have to kind of be in that place, like to go back to the servant figure in Faulkner, right, of the enduring, right? Now that this does not mean, it's interesting because I was thinking about this. This does not mean that you necessarily like put yourself in a dangerous place, right? Emotionally, physically. But the idea of returning to home is to have a better, it's almost like, how do you return to your own self? How do you return to a place of like the reality that is your own existence? And I mean, that's kind of like the closest home we have is our bodies, right? That's the closest home we have. So it's really important, because returning to home, because I was thinking about like, well, what, it's like, are we talking about literally like go get in your car and go drive back to your childhood home and go there? Like, doesn't matter if you sold the house, like just go, it's like, what do we mean exactly? Like by return to home? And I think there, I do kind of feel like there's this kind of really strong sense of returning to the body. And also to biology, which Daniel and I were talking a lot about, with this idea of how if we kind of lose touch with our biology and our bodies, then we will inevitably become like being kind of just move to the head, just move to the reason, just move to the attempt for the all, right? And not the gap that our bodies kind of present, and this kind of like very interesting generational time, right? That's held within our bodies, which I thought was such a beautiful description there, Cadell, with the past and the future being held in this present existence. So basically, I think that what's interesting about that too, though, is that as the family moves more into the headspace, right? Because on a very practical level, we are less. We don't work the land as much. We don't. And these are very traditional concepts, and I'm not trying to paint them as some sort of like, utopic vision or like ideal, but this is just on a very practical level, with a need for us to do a certain work looks different today than it did in the past. And it's less connected to our physical, like us actually being very immersed with our own two hands, with what we actually like consume. Like I think about food a lot. Like, you don't actually like, you get your kiwis, they're like brought to you from Hawaii somehow, but you never knew, like your hands weren't in that soil. You were not like in that particular atmosphere and climate that actually made the kiwis. And there's something about this sort of like distancing that happens with like what we consume, that then ends up making us feel like almost less at home in our own bodies, I want to say, because there's sort of strangeness of like, it's almost like because our bodies can result in families that can result in trauma, we're almost like afraid of our own bodies, you know, we're afraid of our own potential, because it's very scary because, you know, as Davood, you alluded to with like just this ambiguity, you don't actually, there's such a huge risk, even when you're trying to be like a good parent, your child might like interpret it differently, you know, like what you think is loving, or what you think is like, even if you trying to be open, like they might still somehow, you know, get offended or interpret it differently, or be like, well, you know, you and your child may have very different personalities, and then boom, that can arise. And so it's very difficult. I mean, I think the kind of the hope then for me that I think about is always like, it's just kind of like the open hand analogy. I mean, I use this analogy a lot, but basically something that could possibly be important here in terms of like this kind of constant restructuring and allowance for that is to have basically an open hand, right? You don't clutch onto what exactly things should be like, or like what exactly a father should be, what exactly, you know, my child should be to me, or whatever. You have an open hand. And even though you're going to make mistakes in that, you at least can say, I understand that I don't actually know. And I will always do my best, but even my best will not be your best. You know, even my best will not be necessarily considered even good potentially, but I'm going to hold an open hand, and I will never basically like enforce that upon another person. You know, you can't really be hammering stuff if you keep your hand open, right? Is kind of the idea. And also, like, if we're thinking about in relationship, this is like the ultimately the way you can have like relationships that I think can be can really thrive is to be able to have an open hand to what that relationship is, kind of like what you're talking about, Javier, with your father. But basically the idea is that you don't have, it's so strange, it's like you can't have expectation in a sense for what something's going to look like. And, you know, in this analogy, I often talk about, like, you know, if we talk about love and the bird handler and the bird, you know, if you see the one man like clutching onto the bird's just like flapping its wings, trying to get away. It's so desperate to get away. You're like, okay, that's interesting. Like, that man has that bird, but he's like, the bird looks like it does not want to be there, you know? Whereas if you see like the gentleman or the woman who is, you know, basically just, there's a bird on her or his shoulder, the bird goes away, and it can look for a moment like that's not that person's bird, right? Or something, like they don't know each other. Like the bird just happened to land on his or her shoulder, but it goes away and it goes on this like journey. And you actually don't know if it will come back or not, but it does come back because it knows that person and it desires to be there. But it's almost like it also may have a desire to fly away again. And so there's something very interesting there about, like, I mean, I can't help but make me think a little bit about like Rilke and protecting people's solitude and the difference, the protection for that, to basically say like I'm not going to like you know, define my reality and family and life and myself by if I'm clutching the bird, like if I have the bird or not. And so I that openness is so crucial. But it's so hard because we are talking about like binding type of family structure, like, you know, relationships, like,
what's the balance?
You know, like, I mean, we're married, so it's like, you know, you actually stay married. I mean, this is like a sustained type of thing,
right?
You know, so what is it? So kind of thinking about like the idea, it's a very kind of ironic bound unboundness that I think is like this space that we're trying to really dig into how that works best, and how that can maybe actually prove like, you know, good, you know, for the two people involved, and then for children, and then for the society at large. But I do think the open hand is really important, because I think there's a lot of room there for curiosity and for a sense of always being able to learn again, like be willing to learn again. And then also, I'll say this really quick, because we've moved into maybe more of the headspace with where it gets more into the like psychological issues of the family space, and not like the practical, like, oh, you know, Uncle Tim needs to go cut wood so we can have a fire tonight, and you know, all of that. It's like we in making it that, I think we do take things very, so it's tied to the word personality. We kind of like deify personality, and in a sense, because like it's like we've moved to that psychological space, which isn't bad. There's a very important role for psychology, and we desperately need it, even more so in this type of time that we live in these modern time where we are less tied to the physical spaces around us. But what I mean to say is, like, we end up, it becomes about personality, and so then we end up taking things very personally. We take things very personally. Like if you know, you're willing to hear your uncle's language about plants, but they won't listen to your language about philosophy, you're like, they hate me. Like they hate me. I'm not desirable. I am, you know, I'm just like, I'm not worth it, like worthy of attention or time. And, you know, the thing is, we have really strong human desire and need. And so it's hard, because I think we have to remember how much fullness we have in our own bodies. If we bring it from the taking things personal to the, wow, my body itself has a fullness, you know what I mean? Then I think we can, I wonder if there could possibly be a space for redemption there, in seeing our own capacity. And then it's like, you know what? Yeah, I would love it if somebody would, because the other thing too is, like, you know, you may have family members who don't even want to share their language. You know, you've got your uncle here being like, come check out my plants, but you might have a family member who doesn't open up their language to you, and you're like, I just want to know, I just want to speak your language. Like, God help me. I just want to, I don't want, whatever you want to talk about, I want to talk about it with you, you know, and yet they won't, right? Or maybe they haven't developed their own language. I mean, I think a lot of people have not, because we don't talk about these things, right? And so I guess what I mean to say is, like, in that place of potential pain, I wonder if instead of taking it personally, we could say, yeah, I do feel a loss there, but I'm not going to hold on to that loss, open-handedness, and I'm going to instead continue to develop my own language in my own body and understand the potential of my own self, which I don't know, again, it could seem like it maybe that can seem selfish, but at the end of the day, like, you live with yourself. You know, you go to bed with yourself and you wake up with yourself, and you are always in your own body and mind. So it's like you want to develop that, because you might not be getting it from family members, to be honest. You may, I mean, maybe you're very, you know, you have a richness of that in your family, and that's great. But if we're talking about some of the tragic situations of family, sometimes you're not getting that. And so, I mean, I think the best thing that could happen is to maybe bring it back down into a located space of your own self and say, I'm not receiving that, and I really would like to, but at the same time, I'm going to kind of relish in my own language and really develop that. And you know, the hope would be that would also attract, right? Like, that attracts people, because they're like, wow, you're speaking this language, and it's like when you experience new cultures and you're like, this is so cool, I just want to go experience it, I want to dip my, you know, immerse myself in that, you know. So, and then you get the opportunity to then hear the other person's language. So gee, guys, there's so many more notes here, and I just wanted to kind of, I guess, talk on the things that were immediately coming to my mind here, but that's really what I wanted to respond with at this time.
Wow. There's so many things. That's just rushing into me. I feel like there's been just like this beautiful thread that's been woven through all of the different pieces that people have given. I like what Davood brought in terms of the inability to kind of fully speak to the family. Like, there's a kind of emptiness in it. There's a kind of incompleteness in it. There's the individual, you know, aspects. We're all involved in this like interpersonal world of like being individually incomplete, and then that kind of spurred this idea of you never had a father. Xavier, oh my God, I love that idea. You realize you never had a father, you know, like, you're like, oh, okay. I mean, and that made me immediately think of like the way that I felt about my dad. And I think I even still do, where I'm like, that's my dad. He's my father, you know, he's mine. Like, and kids go through this stage where they're like, this is my dad, this is my mom. And kids will even like compete with each other, you know, to have all of the attention of the parent, you know, and be like, no, that's my mom, that's not your mom. Like, I get mom, you don't. So there's all of this like conflict that can occur even within sibling dynamics, and like attention and all of this stuff that you then move through, right? And this idea that as an adult you come to some point where you realize, oh, you know, this category, this ideal of the father, or the ideal of the mother, like, can never be reached. And in that sense, you've never had a father, you never had a mother. And then that expands this notion, because I think, I had the unique experience of my mother dying when I was quite young. And that really shifted perspective for me. Something that I think a lot of people don't experience until they're much older, which is like the shift in role when you lose a parent. Because suddenly you've kind of taken a little bit of that for yourself. Like I took the mother into me in a way that I didn't previously have contact with. My whole world had been within the context of my mother, and had she continued to live, I would not be aware of that yet. So the death of a parent is the emergence of the notion of the father. You can't actually understand it fully as you're moving through your life with that person. But when you're on the deathbed of your parent and you're seeing them through to the other side, and then suddenly you were the oldest one. You were the one to inherit this idea. It goes into you. That's a total reframing of this idea. And like, there's then both parents, right? So there's all of this complexity in having this kind of relationship hold you through some time in your life. And if you do have intergenerational passing, for many years, for many generations, you may not have a rupture that makes that conscious within the family. You may not fully understand how those roles are being held, how that world is being contained, how there's a kind of hard body that's created by the adults, particularly the adults in the middle. I loved what Cadell was saying in terms of the asymmetries here of family. The adults have to be in this servant role where the old people and the children are both the most attended to in this particular time. And that requires a lot of strength of giving up personality, giving up the fact that you want to be reciprocated to, right? Like you have to kind of let go of that, the resistance that, oh, well, I'm not going to take care of my mother because she's not going to give me the attention that I want. Like I know she's like 80 years old, but like, I don't want to do that. Or like, I'm not going to, give time or attention to my child because I know that the minute that, they're older, they're just going to like turn away from me and they're not going to care about me anymore. Like it can't be transactional. It can't be, just by the nature of the asymmetrical dynamics. There's no way to think of these things in terms of some like equal playing field where you're putting coins of equal weight on each side of a scale. You're in this space of, well, if you can embrace the idea of service, then you have the potential to deepen your character and hold the uncertainty of the situation, which is that you may never have it be reciprocated. You may never know. You may give all the care and love in the world to your children, and you may never know if they will take care of you when you're old. And you can't do it that way. You can't be like, oh, if I care for you, then when I'm old, you'll care for me, right? It's like, well, actually, if you think of it that way, there's this transactional, strategic kind of aspect of what's going on, that doesn't actually surrender to the agency of the child or the agency of the grandfather. I loved what you were saying, Xavier, about your family and your mom trying to shave your grandfather and him being angry. Like this is the same dynamic in my family. Like my aunt is trying to change things for my grandma. And my grandma's like, yo, you don't understand what I need. You're not trying to learn my language. You're not empathizing with me. And she's saying no. She says no. And then my aunt's like, why doesn't she want my help? Why doesn't she think I know what to do? She doesn't care. Like, takes it personally. Back to that. Takes it personally. And my grandma's like, whatever. Like, I'm not going to cooperate with you. Like you haven't ever tried to like figure out how to understand me. Right. And so there's this gap, right? There's this gap. And the person who can fill the gap, like, and I mean, just in my personal life, I'm finding myself in the unique position to do this. But sometimes in a family, a generation, no one can do that. There's not a single person who has the capacity to fill the gap. And that's a dark moment for a family in terms of its intergenerational dynamics, right? You may end up with children who are watching their parents fail to fill the gap. And then those children have an extra burden. They often become like adult or philosophical, very young. I think this is a similar thing. like, you know, in my family, right? My mother was like the kind of philosophical black sheep child of her dysfunctional family. My father was the philosophical black sheep child. Both of them were the youngest children. And then my brother and I, we were both inherited a dysfunctional family of people who had a lot of childhood trauma. And then we both became very philosophically oriented. And so like, there's this, I think that there is this pattern of being like, when you're young, when you're like 5 years old and you're watching a chaotic, dysfunctional relational dynamic, like you were saying about like, you don't know what reality is. Suddenly you're thrown into into an existential point of view. You're like, I don't know what reality is. How do I discover as a 5-year-old how to root myself in some kind of reality? And I have to turn to often myself, my personality, me, in order to figure out how to navigate the like relational complexity and chaos of my environment with these large figures who I can't fully understand because they're at points in development that are beyond my capacity to mirror or model, right? And so that puts the child into this position of observation and tinkering and trying to put together from their own point of view what's happening within their family. And I have to think, it's so amazing this time that we live in, because you're right, we have been removed from the necessities of taking care of the energy, the creation of energy in our environments. Like, okay, we don't have to use our own physical metabolisms in order to gather food. We don't have to use our own physical metabolisms in order to gather heat energy, right? We can offload that to fossil fuels, and we can then live in a different kind of energy world, an energy function. But we don't lose the necessity to care for one another, and we don't lose the fact that our energy then primarily turns into relational energy, and that we're all seeking it. We're all seeking relational energy, like, because all of these other consumptive needs have been taken care of by this energy that has been borrowed from the past, is also being borrowed from the future, and it's creating this like weird sense of time, right? Because we're also in this strange context in terms of life, life being taken and being converted into materials and generating all of the bodies that we have today, right? It's a very strange period of time in terms of Earth's history, and the biomass that kind of has flourished, and also the biomass that has been lost within the context of this like energy world that we live in. But it means that we've been able to turn into almost kind of in an insular way into the intersubjective nature of human life, into the romantic, right? The romantic possibility, like, of meeting somebody and it coming from the universe and it charging you with so much energy, and that causing you to like go into your body. You break out of your mind, you go into your body, and you release this passion into the world. And it's chaotic, and it's full of conflict, and there's all sorts of grasping and resistance and fighting your desire to control, and also living through your desire to control, and doing it with this other person, and having to deal with their imperceptibility, their dynamicism, their history, their life, and that like very engrossed quality of intimate relationships. It's such a charge of energy, and I feel like we seek it out. We also seek out the things that catalyze rupture, and cause that kind of channel to go through us and break our ego structures, break our incomplete notions, give us a glimpse of the possible unity that we can experience within ourselves, right? It just gives us a glimpse. And if we can follow that glimpse and realize, oh, okay, like it's within me. It's within me, the capacity to love. It's within me, the capacity to give. If I can unify with myself, then I can give without, in this totally bizarre space. I think you were talking about it so brilliantly, Michelle, of like, okay, like there's like expectation, you want to like be able to understand the future, you want to live in multiple periods of time. There's also I think a lack of tools for communicating the fact that when we're with someone, sometimes we feel like we're in multiple times. Like, yeah, you're married, but like maybe it's just that you're in multiple times together when you're together, right? And you've just like you've figured that out together. It's become conscious, and then the decision to become married just became natural, right? you know, and the fact sometimes you do that. Sometimes you meet someone, you're like, oh, we're living in multiple times together. We're living in the past, we're living in our childhoods, we're living in the future, we're living when we're old. And that can be very confusing, because then instead you're like, oh, I need commitment. I need you to tell me, like, you're going to be there in the future. Or like, you owe it to me to figure out what happened in my past and help me understand my trauma, right? Like, your brain can start to want to like hold on to things in order to keep that relationship and keep that energy where it is, right? Because it's like, it can be so powerful. But if you don't, you know, if you don't let it go, if you don't like allow for the imperceptibility of the other, and like standing on the edge of the void, and like embracing the sense of time that is like beyond anything that's like linear, you know, this kind of associative world, which like you kind of enter into when you're in this intersubjective intimate space that's like hyper personal, and like and then it also goes beyond the thing that's being said, right? This is the other thing I thought about with the uncle and the plants. This is the thing I've been thinking about with my grandma. We were spending a lot of time just like really not talking that much. I mean, she's very old, you know, but there was so much communication that was going on. But it was going on this like other level, this like subliminal level, but that became conscious to me because I wasn't fixated on the particular words that were being said. I wasn't like, oh, the content of this is what's important to me. The content is like about plants or not about plants, right? Like, it's like, no, actually it's this deeper layer of communication that's occurring. It's like the plants are like, not like a medium, right? It's like a bridge, but it actually is this like lower level of communication. That's where the energy is. Like, that's where the depth is. That's where you're going to be stirred, you're going to be touched by someone else. And that being touched is like the opening into the knowledge of being individual. And if we can't open ourselves, if we can't see our incompleteness, if we can't see the incompleteness of others, the imperceptibility of others, that there's all of this undulating change that's occurring, there's all of this like strangeness of time, we close ourselves off to these experiences, which I think goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. Family, it's an experience. It's an experience. You feel it in your body. You know it because it's salient. You know, the actual tangible tactile experience. And this is what we still have. Like, yeah, I'm not chopping wood and I'm not gathering you know, vegetables right now in my life, but I am working practically in my relationships. And those are, I mean, gosh, what is a more complex thing to interact with but another human being? Another human being. Like, especially in family, it's not just the dyadic relationship of like of a romantic dynamic. It's the structure of the family. And there's all sorts of weird stuff that I've become to notice, and I don't know how to understand it conceptually, about like the way that different psyches fit different niches. And the, like, my brother and I, for example, the way that he and I have situated towards my grandma, who, while she is a kind of tremendous figure in my family, she's also a tyrannical one and has also been very abusive to people, right? So, you know, the way that my brother and I have oriented towards her is different, and both are true. For me, I have opened myself to serve her despite this, whereas my brother has decided that he's going to treat her like a human being, like he would treat any other human being who was being abusive to him, and have boundaries. I have decided I have no boundaries. I'm going to serve her, and I'm going to learn how to love her, even in the face of this, you know, tyrannical nature that she has. And he is saying, look, you know, you're not treating me properly. You're not, we need to figure out a way to come into relationship equally, you know, in order to engage with each other. And I feel like there's something about how the family is holding all of these different ways of relating to the gravitational pull at the center, which is my grandmother, right? And so that's really weird. Like, there's something about like how families are structured that also kind of gets into the uncanniness of being individual, of being like, your personality is not being some sort of like special and like intrinsic thing to you, but rather like an emergent property of like the relational dynamics that you find yourself in as you grow up, and how these things can also be intergenerational. Like, I have things from my grandmother. I know, like, personality structures. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so much like her. you know, in all these ways. And I'm like, oh God. I mean, and that's like really important for me because like there's a power in the personality structures that he has, but there's also this shadow side of being a tyrant, right? Like in the matriarch or in any role of authority, you have the possibility of being both, you know, the giving, serving leader or the controlling, domineering leader. And, you know, my grandmother has really gone into the domineering kind of path. That's what she was doing in our family. And when I was observing this as a child, I was like, she was a negative example for me. She was like, I do not want to be like her when I'm old. And yet as I've gotten older, I've realized how much I have similar personality structures. I'm like, oh God, and like, okay, am I gonna fall into the same traps? Am I on a different path? How do I actually reckon with these things? I thought I had gotten away from them, then they show up again in another relationship. And like they come back to you like these weird ghosts. And if you participate in relationships, you find it. But it requires so much, oh my God, humility, like willingness to be broken, willingness to like totally turn into liquid and like become this like unstructured, you know, superheated kind of mess so that you can recrystallize into a new form, right? Like you have to be willing to accept your own impermanence, which I think goes back to what Michelle was saying. It like, once again, yes, your home is in the body, but the self is not a permanent self, right? It's not some sort of it's not a personality. It's not. And like the personality is an aspect of the self, but it's not the fundamental nature of the self, you know. And so it's and that there's these phase transitions, right? Like there's these fundamental restructuring that can happen of your way of relating in your world, that open up these kinds of possibilities. And the family, Keegan has this thing where he's, you know, he's I think probably all of you know about him, but you know, developmental psychologist with this theory of adult development, that your problems kind of create the environment for a transcendence of a previous developmental stage, right? It's the pressure of your relational environment that basically cracks your operating system for how to be in the world, and suddenly your problems work on you and release you into a new orientation in reality. And you have a different sense of self, a different subjective nature that you're working through as you go through these stages. So there's something kind of sad to me, or like at least there's like there's like a road not taken when people take themselves out of their family dynamics and they don't return to them in some way or another, because the problems there, especially if they're in the Goldilocks zone of like being like complicated and difficult and deep, but also being workable, and that there's some slack and some willingness to actually engage with them in a way that could shift literally the like the path of your lineage, right? Like that Goldilocks zone, if you can go back to your family and embrace that. And that might not even be like being in relationship to all your family members. It could be being in relationship to one family member. You know, it could be whatever is related to that specific context that you happen to be in. But that has the possibility of changing so much through so many different dimensions of time, that for people to be, you know, more concerned with like what their friends are doing, or like what the next job is going to be, or like, you know, whether or not they can extend their childlike nature as adults, right? They don't want to grow up. They don't want to submit themselves to the role of service, right? Like this extension. Like there's so many ways to complain about millennials online, right? Like you can see evidence for this everywhere. This like unwillingness to take this adult role in the world, and it's a path that I think, you know, if collectively, if there's like a certain critical mass of people, of individuals who take on this calling, the kinds of second, third order effects of this type of thing are extraordinary. They're just absolutely extraordinary. And so, I mean, that I think that that's something I've recognized in my life, because it's only something you can decide to do it, right? Like you can decide to talk to your uncle about plants, you can decide to understand why your father might not want to have his beard shaved, right? Like those are the kinds of things that you can decide to do. And you may not have anyone sharing that with you. You may not have friends who are doing the same thing. You may not have relatives who are doing the same thing. But I also think that there is the possibility that just brings more energy into the world. It just like catalyzes these capacities, and there's potential there. There's an uncertain potential, not only for like the family and the lineage and the person, but also on a larger scale, what this kind of move could do for where we are in our kind of civilizational story. I'll stop there. Take it from me, Davood.
Thank you all. I'm so happy that we paid attention to. We have been paying attention to family, not from the perspective of the child, which is certainly one possible perspective to get into and think about family, but also from more responsible perspectives of serving, and more maybe closer to parental, maybe not literally parental, but responsible. I hear this especially in Raven's, Daniel's, and Michelle's discussion. It's very the responsibility of participation, being a responsible participant. But one of the things that I cannot shake off is that Javier moment when he was talking about his uncle. And what stood out to me the most was that moment when Javier is meditating that this is my uncle. This is my uncle. This is, for me, a very rich and very profound and almost endless statement. And what I would add to that, inspired by my own experiences with my families, is that, yeah, this is my uncle, and this is how I fail with my uncle. It includes that failure too. It's not like, oh, this is a great moment and me and my uncle are so great. Oh, wow, we are a model of how family members should relate to each other. No, this is how we tried. And despite we both trying, I just don't get plants. I want to do this, but our languages are so different. And this is our failure. And this is family. This is family too. This failure, this moment of trying and not succeeding is our share of this concept that in its transcendental form is shiny and successful. But in our case, it happens to be a moment of failure. And then we can try again. We are finite, but we get more than one attempt. I recently read about pragmatism, something related to Peirce, and the emphasis on most people most of us, not let's not blame those people who think wrongly about pragmatism. Most of the time we think quickly about pragmatism, the textbook textbook summaries of pragmatism, like if something is effective, then it is true. But Peirce, getting to Charles Sanders Peirce more closely and carefully, what he's saying is closer to saying if something is true, then its effectiveness will be shown to us. If my relationship with my father or if my relationship with my uncle is a true relationship, if it is a truthful relationship, then I will get its effect, its emotional effect, its cognitive effects, its embodied effect in those moments. And if it is not true, if I fail to invest in it properly or spend time with it, then its effectiveness will not show. I really like that reference to Dumbledore that Cadell made. And it reminded me again, staying with the theme of failure. Dumbledore did similar things with Tom, who later became Voldemort. He showed up in a similar way, and that's something that can happen. The way his attitude of responsibility, that in the back of his mind, there's so much that I cannot tell you. There's so much, you had to be there. That attitude of I'm just too old to tell you everything I know, but I'm going to give you pieces, and based on these pieces, you will get the meaning of what I'm telling you, hopefully in the future, and you can act with them. And in general, I think this is family is many things. It's a place where we serve. Of course, it's also a place when it functions. It's a place where we become stronger, we become more powerful, we can stand up, we can do things because of how our families energize us, give life to us, shape us, organize us. When, those moments that, those miraculous moments. I have these rare occasions when I'm around my family. I feel like, oh my God, this is how it feels like to be loved. To have a drama-free, this is what it's supposed to be. And then I get a glimpse of that transcendental concept of family. And then I was like, no, forget it. This is my share. This is what I got. And I'm happy with these moments. One thing I wanted to include, because we had very many beautiful literary references here related to serving and not servitude, serving and helping. There's this short novella by Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Ivan Ilyich is old man, is dying slowly, and one of the surprising things about the process of his dying slowly is that nobody cares about him. Nobody truly respects him, cares about him, and he has one servant. He's a young man, a healthy young man, and he shows up for him. And there's this moment where Ivan Ilyich wants to test him, so he asks him a pointless. He gives him a pointless request. He said, "Can you hold up both my feet?" And the servant says, "Okay, I will do." And Ivan Ilyich says, I experience a lot of intense pain, except when you hold my feet above the bed. And so he makes this poor servant keep his legs up for like an hour. And he wants to. There's something in that pointlessness. There's something in that the absurdity that you're doing this only because you care, not because you get the instrumental value of your action. You're only doing this because and he really needs that. Ivan Ilyich really needs that, to feel that somebody is doing something pointless for him, which is only out of care, not because, going back to Javier's scenario, if you are also passionate about plants, then you want to look at those plants not because you care about your uncle, but if you don't care at all about your plants, then you only pay attention to them because of your uncle. And so instrumentally, functionally, it is a pointless act, but because it is pointless, it is so meaningful with respect to the family. And I also really liked what Michelle said, that at the end of the day, you are by yourself. And I remember those moments where I was a student. I was doing my best to be a good student, and I would choose occasionally not to spend time with my family for long periods of time. I wouldn't see my family, and then at the end, I would discover that this is not enough. This is what is this? What am I doing? That at the end of the day, you're alone. You're by yourself, and what you did was meaningful, but it didn't work out. It feels like a failure. It feels like you are not, because I am not just me, because I by myself isn't enough. It's far from enough. So investing just on myself as a personality, as an individual, and neglecting the other people that I'm connected with, that I'm supposed to live with, and live in a way that is mindful of them, not doing that really feels like not doing the right thing. And it has a lot to do with identifying yourself. So returning to the family, I'll end with this. Returning to the family, to me, it means opening that project, or renewing the project of identifying ourselves, who we are, and what we're up to, and bringing other people in that question. bringing our connections, both connections that exist already, and connections that are in the future. Okay, thanks again, everybody. Back to Javier.
Man, this is like starting to feel like the way Cadell was entered into this. Like I already feel myself at the waters right here. There was something that I realized that Davood was, when he was speaking, I couldn't help but like say it to myself. This whole aspect of serving, right? And the bringing up of Voldemort, right? Of the people that you serve and the people that maybe you hope serve you. So there's the real risk is this. I hope, if you do serve, and it's kind of implicit and it sounds very crude, but it's like, if you do serve, I hope that you're ready to also die at the same time. And that's a very serious thing to accept. That if you're going to serve, I hope that you're also ready to be killed in the process, and for the others to betray you. It's that real tangible metaphorical death, and maybe even a real physical death too. And that's what I was thinking, because it's one thing to, like I said, serve my uncle and be in his language, but it at any moment I could die, just for, I don't, he doesn't return it or whatever. But there's this aspect that Michelle brought that I believe, where it's like we are by ourselves again. I think this is a really crucial thing to look at, because not only is it the despair, but also the hope at the same time, because it means that the family can start again. It means that it can start again. It is because it circles this way that the family can start again, that you return back to being an orphan. Let's just put it that way. That at every moment, when I say that you must be ready to prepare to die, that at any moment, I hope that you're ready to become an orphan again, and it's only in, I feel like, this is my opinion, but I feel like it's only in this specific moment that the family itself can start again, right? And I think Harry Potter is like a perfect example of this, right? Harry Potter is an orphan, and he's got the crack of the scar in his head, the negativity, right? And I thought that was such a good example to use now that I think about it, because how does Harry Potter start a family again? His actual biological family is gone, from what I recall, right? He doesn't, for him, they're gone, right? And what's I think what's important is that not only in starting again, is that we also can make we can meet metaphorical family members with other people. And remember when I talked about there's this aspect of preserving the sacredness of motherhood and fatherhood? Dumbledore, I think for Harry Potter, preserves this aspect of fatherhood that is sacred for him, because he doesn't know, in some ways. But I think it's because that we can start again and then have these different relationships with different people that are not our biological family members. That the real tangible part about going back into the biological family is that you have somebody else outside the family that kind of serves as the mother, the father, the friend, the brother, the sister. I mean, cultural references are filled with this, right? Like my work hubby. It's my work hubby, right? You need some type of tangible emotional space when you're working, that somebody kind of like acts like the husband, or or somebody acts like the wife in your workspace, right? You're like, oh, thank you. Like, you really keep me centered in this workspace, because honestly, my mother or my husband, they're far away right now, right? They can't serve that space for me. But it's only because that we can have relations with people outside the biological family, that if you do return to your biological family, that you don't hold these horrible grudges, like, oh, you weren't there for me, Dad. You weren't there for me. I think this allows you to actually start again, right? It wipes it into some degree. And it actually does remind me of the talk that me and Davood had, where I said, my biggest fear as a father is when the kid's eventually going to say to me, because to me, it's inevitable. The kid's going to say to me, I hate you, Dad. I hate you. And Davood said, well, you know what? Actually, it's not that despairing, because that means he's communicating to you. He's at least telling you he has enough. He feels comfortable enough to return to you and say, I hate you, Dad. And that means there's hope. And that's all that Davood was trying to say, is that means there's hope. But where Davood pointed out that there gets really scary is when the kid doesn't tell you at all. And there's nothing that is said in this whole thing. So when I say that these outside relations outside of the biological family, my hope is that you do return. You do return to the biological family in some way. Maybe not all of it. I'm not asking you to return to the abusive father or so on. I'm not asking any of that. But there's an aspect to, because what's interesting about, if there's one abuser in the family, it affects the rest of the family. So starting a family again is trying to reconnect with the people that were just like you in that same process of the hands of the abuser. I hope that makes sense. Because I feel like what happens with traumas like these is like Daniel was pointing out, like each individual family member came up with a different response, and they separated with each other completely, it felt like. So I feel like, and like Davood alluded to, it's the aspect of that failure, it's because it's dysfunctional that it works, or that it can start again. It's because it's dysfunctional that it's proof that it can start again. So I guess that's what I'm going to say. So I don't want to go quite over 2 hours. I think this has been a great talk. So what I'll do is I will just like let everybody kind of do like a quick, last minute say, and then we'll close, because I think 2 hours is probably long enough for people. All right.
I don't know if I can. It's hard to do a quick close. That's the problem. It's not too much and not enough or something. What to say?
Actually, how about we do this? We can just do one full round
of closing.
One full round of like saying what you need to say. I won't put a time limit.
Yeah, let's try to be succinct, and then we'll do our best, I guess. Okay, so yeah, I think for me, in order for categorization, or in order for language to be true, or however you want to say it, you need to somehow decide its relationship to death, in order for to be really in service. So like that was sort of like the formula you proposed, Javier, of service and death. And so for me concretely, very practically, I mean, my service at the moment is related to knowledge. like related to how I give myself in various contexts as some sort of philosopher. And very practically what that means for me in terms of being in service is being more and more aware that the younger people who pay attention to me and learn from me are basically going to kill me. Like they're not going to, and that I should like that, and that's a good thing, but it creates a problem. The problem it creates is that I can't just open myself to being killed. I have to find the best way to die. So that's basically my struggle, as it relates to the identity that I'm presenting to the world, as it relates to the identity which I present to all of you. It's basically, I know that I have no desire to be like a guru who people identify with, because it's super cringy and super horrible to be in that situation. And I think anyone who has the motivation to be in that position is their very knowledge structure is suspect to begin with. But the struggle for being the type of individual who's in service and is in service inclusive of dying is that you do have the ethical problem of how do I die well, and that's just an ongoing struggle. And so in that attempt to think that, and in my sort of reflections on what all you were saying, I would bring it back around to my original reflection on the sort of dialectic of the transcendental categorization and the deconstructive categorization, which informed the history of my romantic life. The transcendental categorization, I think, is like a perfect time without body. This might take some thinking to grasp fully, but it's basically like a perfect form of time, and your body isn't there. The paradox you run into in this space is that you think you had something completely, but you never had it. So like Javier had that example with the father. I think Raven reflected on that as well. You have this paradox, and like for example, for me, like when I consider my first girlfriends, they're really not my first girlfriends. like I never had those. And that's sort of like the paradox of the absolute, or the ironic nature of the absolute, is that the absolute, what's the formula? I wrote down what I think the formula is something like, the absolute is structured in such a way that you think you hold as if you really hold, but you never actually held. It's kind of like a weird thing. And then I think then like the deconstructive categorization is the opposite. It's the body without time. And I think that I actually think a lot of modern sexuality is the deconstructive form, where it's the body without time. You're just bodies, and you don't want to have any categories. And so that's the opposite of the perfect time without body. So some relationship between those two brings me to what I call like, or what I'm trying to think, it could be named many different things, but the various words that I associated with it was either traumatic categorization, negative categorization, death categorization. It's trying to get at the same thing. But that type of categorization is the opposite of over-personalization of categorization, obviously. That's what that's really trying to get at. It's the opposite of that. And that form of categorization can handle paradox. And it's kind of like, instead of the perfect time without body, or the body without categorization, it's kind of like the soul is the body, or the perfection is the body, and it's like kind of like in relationship to Michelle's example of the open hand, it's like the hand itself, the form of the hand itself, or the form of the body itself, is like the temporal categorization. Maybe it's too complex. There's some other thoughts I have, but basically what I'm trying to get at is that what's at stake, I think, is a type of speech and a type of knowledge which is in service of the true and which is capable of becoming more and more real. And that we need those types of subjects to be the types of subjects that want to build families. Because if those types of subjects can exist and not build families, oftentimes they build, for example, maybe communes, or they build like spiritual centers, or, you know, like, I don't know, they do something beyond the family. They try to transcend the family, which is another possibility, which you can do. That, like, the energy has to go somewhere. That's something that can be done. But I guess the paradox is that those types of beings sometimes or oftentimes don't want to build family or don't want to have family, which means like people are having kids unconsciously. Like that brings me to the philosophical question: is like, is every child born an unconscious fantasy? Like, if we fully have like something like absolute knowing, like, does that equal not reproducing or something like that? Or, like, do subjects of absolute knowing reproduce, or are they? That's just an open question for me, and something to think about. But it's like, yeah, that's it. Like, ideally, that type of subject is the type of subject that can hold the paradoxes and the ironic nature of the types of beings we are and the types of things that family is. And that's maybe all I have to say. And thank you guys all for this space, and appreciate being here.
Well, goodness, this is magnificent. And Javier's like quick answers. Ha! Okay, that's funny. Everyone's magnificent, just truly magnificent. Cadell, you say something. I've heard you say before that a problem today is that kids are having kids. I think that's magnificent. That's a problem. I have a few things to say. First, Raven was talking about energy and how that, I think Mr. Hag, when he talks about the connection between fossil fuels or energy sources and metaphysics, that's really important. There's a few things, something that should be noted. If we follow Augustine or Dante or whatever, all evil is a result of a disordered love. All evil is a result of a disordered love or good. There's nothing wrong with sex, but there can be something wrong with lust. There's nothing wrong with food, but there can be something wrong with gluttony. And in Dante, there's actually a part where a mother wants to see her child, and she's like in the purgatory or whatever, and the angel, I can't remember which, or someone, I think maybe it's Virgil, who says, well, you'll see your child. So it's like, I want to do it now. I want to do it now. And runs off into hell because she so much wants to see her child that she goes to hell to see him. Like sends herself off. So love actually results in deconstruction. In the same way, it's hard to imagine, say, Nazi Germany without vision, right? You have to have passion and vision. The problem is it's disordered, right? So it's all about disorder. And so the question is, how do we order? Something that's really important is a lot of people want to talk about society and the new society we want to make, but they don't want to talk about family. But all society ultimately is going to emerge out of the organization of your family, because that almost makes it too concrete, right? People don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about their new social organization, but not talk about the family. So I think what's being done here is very important. And also, it is only in the realm of family that you can figure out, like, that's going to teach you the right way to love, or at least that's your first other, right? That's where you kind of learn what love looks like. And if you have not a good understanding of the right way to have family, which then will get us into the question of what that looks like today with absolute knowing and so on and so forth, which would not make this a short answer, then the problem is you have a lot of disordered love, and that gets translated to the social level. And then there's a lot of disordered love. And that's going to then contribute to lots of different problems. Each one of the family members in The Sound and the Fury is a kind of disordered love. Quentin is like, the problem is Caddy is a vision, right, of the perfect world and the perfect. And once she proves not to be, and she proves, to be a person, it destroys Quentin. And what he does is he runs off into something we've talked about before called autonomous rationality. He leaves the family, he reasons, but he doesn't return. But he's also not fully detached, say, like maybe like fully detached, he's still in it. And so that ultimately leads to his destruction. Whereas Jason, he responds by going angry, like getting mad at Caddy, where all of this could have held together. The big question of The Sound and the Fury, and then I think it all kind of leads to, before I move on though, I want to note that on this idea that family, if it's all disordered, you can't even get a sense of the real. You're right. Raven talked about, we talked about with trauma and different things. A lot of time, some of the problem with the discussion about the meaning crisis, there's a lot of talk for Bernanke and the meaning crisis, which you first have to talk about the reality crisis, which is that people have had these traumas or experiences where they can't even determine reality. You can't get meaning if you can't even determine what is real. And so that's going to get into the trauma and the family and these different questions. And upon that, you can then talk about the new possibilities of meaning, which I also want to note, and we've talked about this before, we actually do have an answer to the meaning crisis. Nationalism, fascism, racism, xenophobia, these are all things that societies have done that give people meaning. The issue is that we have a meaning crisis because the old solutions we no longer accept. Unfortunately, there are plenty of people who do accept them, thus the conspiracy, the totalitarianism, the politics, all the different things. The issue is that when we talk about the meaning crisis, it's just very important to realize that it is a negative space, Hegelian space where we are suspending ourselves from other options, looking for something new, right? That's what we're talking about, right? You're looking, but that's going to also talk about dealing with the reality crisis, which means that that's going to deal with the family, because the family becomes the original organizer of your sense of space, time, and reality. And that is all connected to the ordering of your love, which, if it is disordered, then manifests in destructive ways, following Augustine and Dante, different things. I think the final question for me, we talked about serving, death. I think that gets into Christ, as Jesus. He comes, he gives man, he saves, but he gets killed on the cross. Serving and death are linked in Jesus. Then you have the alternative of maybe like we talked with the wonderful Mr. Ebert on the detachment, the guru. These are the options. Option 3, option 4. We've talked about. What does that look like? So on and so forth. I think the big question, if I were to close, and maybe for part 2, that because the speaking with you people is so delightful, I hope we can do 10 of these. In The Sound and the Fury, people don't return to family. Like one of the reasons Southern literature is so interesting is because there is this notion of, oh my gosh, we erected an entire society upon pure evil, but we need to return to family, because if we don't, it's like totally, we go crazy. We turn into a Jason or a Quentin or whatever. And so we're in the space of Dilsey trying to endure the knowledge that we were monsters in this negative space for the possibility of something new. What do we do? So, that's why you have your Faulkners and your O'Connors and Percys that are so fascinating, because it's this question of the need to return to family, but family was a source of the Hannah Arendt banality of evil, slavery, and so on and so forth. Likewise, people could hear this and say, return to family when my dad was abusive. What in the world? What are you talking about? So there's two sides to this question. How do you return to family if it's a source of trauma? Oh, and I should also note that the question of the formation of the family is directly tied to the formation of society. That's another thing that the Southern writers understood, is that the family and the society are kind of mirrors of one another. And so the question of talking about the family is talking about ultimately of what the new society looks like in metamodernity and so on and so forth. So, you've got to see, and the problem is a lot of people want to talk about society and they don't want to talk about family. So you're dealing with something that's in the abstract and it doesn't get to the concrete, to mention on Hegel and Dr. Last, and that can be a problem. And of course, they inform one another. I'm not saying it becomes like a feedback loop. They inform one another. But you have to talk about the family. So I think the questions are this. How do you return to family if there is a trauma or banality of evil there, to use Hannah Arendt's term? And here's the next question. Can you return to family and it not be the same people? Can you return to family and it not be the same people, such as friends? Or communities, like you were mentioning, Cadell? Because I think that's what can you return to family? Can other people than who you have a biological connection with function as family? Which would then get to questions of, can friends raise children? Because this will get tied to children. Or is there something where you need where there's something about family that is a necessary incubator of the raising of children, per se? So can you return to family and be different people? And how do you return to family when you have trauma? Which, of course, if it's trauma, then you have to go to the second question. You have to figure out how to return to family and it be different people. And what does that look like? And is that even possible? I think that, to close, would be the answer to the question of which Dilsey is enduring to find the answer to.
That's good, Daniel. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Goodness, I think I want to keep it to the fact that I'm just very thankful that we can have the conversation, because I think if we're going to navigate these waters and these modern times, in this very unique situation that we are in, that Raven, you've mentioned, it's like we are going to have to get into the philosophy. It's easy to just want to think we don't have to talk about family, we don't have to talk about sex, we don't have to talk about children and procreating and things like that, but we really must, because it's so essential. And then there's also a lot of people doing it without thinking about it, right? As you say, Cadell. And so I think that for me personally, I think the idea of getting back to the dialectic in this conversation, the dialectic between survival and thriving, the dialectic between the mind and the body, the dialectic between this idea of like having a family but also being an orphan, is
Disney
really,
movies. I meant to say that's every Disney movie.
why is
there's
it they have to start with the orphan, right? No, and I mean, I can't help but think of some of the Christian theology where there's this interesting idea of like, no, you have a new father now, and actually in having a new father, you have a better understanding of your own father, because your own earthly father will have he will have his pros and cons per se, right? He'll have his successes and his failures. And so there's something very, very, very interesting about that, because it's like, there's a lot of language of being adopted and into this like new family in this body. But it's like, well, if you're being adopted, like that means you don't have parents, right? And so there's something very interesting that I think presents in like from a Christian theological perspective of the other father. But that actually does inform your real dad, like, and how you see your real dad, and kind of breaks that category of saying like what he is or who he should be, because you understand, oh, right, he's a human. Like, oh, right, he's a person just like I am. And I really, really, really adored so many things that were said here, and like have a jillion notes. But I did wanted to say really, really quick, something that's like never left my mind, completely haunted me ever since Cadell and Javier had their talk on dating like a long time ago, their live, when we talk about the village, like what is a village today? Like what is a village in like a the interconnectedness is there through the internet, but we don't have our bodies like in the same places, you know what I mean? And so, and then also just, our neighbors, and, whether the country or in the cities, but yet we've got this kind of like city that's now everyone can connect to at any time, whether you're in the country or the city, it's very interesting. But yet there's strange isolation that can also happen, right? In like this kind of like very, that some of the things that can be isolating about screen usage, though there's so much connectivity as well. But I guess what I mean to say is like something that I really would love to talk more about is the village, because as a mother, I think about it a lot, because you have these like real little children you're trying to feed and take care of, and it's very busy, and you're just juggling. And so it's kind of like, where does the village fit into this conversation? Because like Raven was saying, these connections to these other types of family members, there's just something that like you just can't understand like what you're missing, but you kind of still have a need for, you still have a desire for, and yet it's like, it's sometimes, I think in today's world, it's hard because we don't have that exactly. And yet I can't just be naive and think that there was some unicorn village idea that was just happening naturally all the time. But I do want to understand what that kind of looks like more today, and what are the like really nitty gritties about like what does that offer, but what is also the risk in that of the village. So anyways, that would be something I'd be definitely interested in talking more about. But literally so many notes here, so many incredible ideas, and I really appreciate everyone's openness open-handedness
Absolutely.
to talk about this subject.
Absolutely.
Wow. This is I feel like for me personally, the timing of this, and receiving this energy from all of you, holding this container so that we can bring forth both the personal and also the philosophical, and also, I mean, I think we're kind of beginning to dance with it, but the religious qualities of this, the sacred qualities of these questions, it's a lot of synchronicity, I guess I would say, for my life personally, in the invitation to be here at the symposium. And I hope that we can continue to have this conversation. That's really already brought up so much for me. I think Xavier brought up death. Yes, I mean, I was just nodding along with deep salience, like that is ultimately the thing to be confronted. And then Cadell brought up the being able to being killed in the right way. I mean, this is the task, right? Like, and this is the tension of the intergenerational dynamic, right? Like we as we live our death, and when we die, we are dying the way that we've lived, right? Those are the things that we're working with. And this also gets into the associative time and everything. But there's also this dynamic of changing hands, power changing hands, passion changing throughout life. The youth turn into the adults turn into the elders, and they then have to serve themselves to be killed so that new life can emerge. And the task of finding a way to be killed the proper way, so that the knowledge that, you know, the young man or the young woman needs in order to commit that act of matricide or patricide comes to them through the solving of the problem of killing the elder, right? Like, that is the way, because you don't want it to be easy. Of course not. Like, that doesn't give the knowledge. It's a kind of puzzle. It's a kind of serving oneself. Like, yes, you can kill me. Yes, I'm embracing your act of killing, but you have to figure out how to do it. You have to do it the right way. You have to find it. You have to find me. You have to get me. And that's the thing. That's the real thing. And like, that's the test of life, right? And can you become the servant of someone else's knowledge, or coming into their knowledge? Can you die in such a way that is a initiation, a transformative experience into a new phase of life for the younger ones, and of course, I think there's a lot of unpacking we can do in terms of like the generational problems that we're in right now. You know, I'm facing that right now with like the particular kind of qualities of my grandmother and her psychological disorder. I love that, right? Disorder is central here. And the way that the psyches of the elders are structured, and how that creates a kind of like problem to be solved by the younger generation in order to transfer that energy that's being held by the elders into the bodies of the young people. And yeah, so I think that there's a larger conversation to be had about like the particular practical intergenerational dynamics that we find ourselves in right now, which is like a huge part of why we're locked up. I think as a society is, you know, everyone has, you know, boomers or whatever, but it's real, you know, there's like really a generation of boomers who are like holding a lot of power and control, and their psyches are structured a certain way, and that they're not necessarily offering themselves to be killed. They're not necessarily embracing their dying.
Can I just, sorry,
yeah,
can I just say
please.
thank you for like how you've articulated it, because I just think that, I mean, it's just touching on so many points that are so relevant to my reflections on ethical dying, and how this relates to generational transmission of knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, excellent, Raven. Really excellent.
Yeah, so good.
Yeah.
You can see why I like having conversations with Raven, eh?
Wise man.
Yeah.
Wage man.
It goes both ways, Cadell. It goes both ways. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much here. I really feel like we've done a really beautiful job, I think, of building a intersubjective context. I'm so excited to read this book that you just, the Faulkner. Oh my God, I had no idea.
Oh, The Sound of Fury. Yeah, man.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
My God. I think, and then I think that there's also a component of this that is about art. That's about storytelling, and kind of the insufficiency of a kind of abstract, decontextualized philosophy for actually getting into the subjective dynamics of these relationships, of the family, of the society, and that both philosophy and storytelling need to kind of synthesize and dance with one another. And that this is also, I mean, this is also what we're being asked for. It's beyond just exposition in this kind of context, in this dialogical context, but also can we breathe this into stories that allow for people to drop into their own subjective worlds and relate, you know, their psyches to an immersive environment that kind of shows implicitly the dynamics that we find ourselves in, you know. And this is another calling, I think, that we haven't even touched on that, but it's been implicit right through the references that we've been drawing out. So I think that's also a thing I would like to put a little pin in.
No, and I will just note, yes, I should be. Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, Chekhov, the Russians are very similar because both of them are operating in a place where the social order has collapsed. And then how do people respond to it? And they don't have any guidance, you know, that we've been talking about, the loss of givens. How do you create family when the models don't work anymore? And I will also note that any philosophy that cannot be successfully manifest into a story, we should be skeptical of, because it may just be an abstraction that can't undergo a negation into concretion. And so, you know, I like to think of literature in the same way that with science, you can often find mathematical proofs to back it. In the same way, you should be able to find a kind of literary proof to back a philosophical idea, if in fact it can enter into the concrete and therefore be a real idea in the sense of, as Dr. Last has said on Hegel.
And just on that connection point before we move to Davood, is that exactly how you're articulating those stories is how we should understand the historical context of Hegel's writing of the phenomenology of spirit, because Hegel was writing the phenomenology of spirit during the collapse of all of the European order after the French Revolution, and he almost didn't even publish the phenomenology of spirit because literally his house was charged by an army, burned by an army while he was trying to get the papers off to a publisher. So it almost never even existed. And then from that, we have sort of a book which has a philosophy which is structured as a story, which is the story of the individual spiritual becoming. So I think there's a connection there which is worth exploring, but for another time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A philosophy that is not storied, we should be skeptical of its capacity to be concrete.
Beautiful. Love it. Well, that just brought a lot of energy in. So I feel like that would be a beautiful thing to
we must do this again. Raven's outstanding.
Yeah,
We've never, Raven, all of you are just so magnificent.
Magical.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. I mean, I'm happy to end on this high note, but I also I feel very grateful for being a part of this conversation. I learned a lot, and I had this image of I had this image of a philosophical stance in relation to a community. I think, for good or ill, we find ourselves sometimes in that distance from the rest of society. A distance that we are either pushed to, or maybe we have found refuge in a distance from the rest of society. And that distance, for me, is, in my mind, it is one of the essential characters of a philosophical life. To be removed and detached, to give yourself the space to examine. But what we are talking about now is to close that distance, to start walking away, and it's really beautiful to find some fellow travelers in this small group that maybe we can take a few steps together in the direction of finding our places again in a larger society and community. So thank you.
All right. Cadell, you want to listen?
No, go ahead.
So I'm going to add a little bit, I know, because I'm a tyrant, and you guys can kill me off in the next episode. But
now you know what it's like to be a patriarch, Javier. There's no winning.
But actually, when you said about the boundaries, I couldn't help, like, I kept thinking about Raven's story. And then what Daniel said about we have a reality crisis. So for me, it follows like this. You have to search for truth first, right? And then once you find truth, that is the only way that you can die well, in my opinion. I mean, Christ doesn't get to pick how he dies necessarily. But he already chose to die that way because he chose to die for the truth. And so his dying for truth is him dying well. So like it circles on itself. But the little caveat that Cadell puts in that makes it complicated is that and it's such a perfect dynamic because Raven stories, it just brings up perfectly, right? The brother and the sister. The sister is willing to die with no boundaries. She already accepted that. The brother is like, yeah, I'm willing to die, but like there needs to be this between us, you know? Because if not, then I'm not going to accept that death, you know? So for him, that's his truth, though. That's his truth. I'm not going to disregard that truth. But for Raven, that's her truth too. So to me, that's like the pin, right? That's like the pin that I can't even answer. But to kind of like caveat on even Don Quixote, right? I want to bring up this aspect of how do we determine what's the difference between a breakthrough and a breakdown? At what point do we decide that this is a breakdown and not a breakthrough? Now, this is something that Deleuze taught me that has haunted me ever since. Because when we talk about personalities, when we talk about disorders that people have, I'm like, I don't even know. Like, at what point do we go, yep, this person is completely, he's lost. He's completely lost. How do we determine that it's not a breakthrough or a breakdown? You know, and that's why I feel like whether it's breakdown or breakthrough, that's the whole point of starting again. You know what I mean? Like you need it happens simultaneously, doesn't it? And the way that I imagine it actually is when Hegel talks about the comparison, when consciousness itself does the comparison and finds the error, there's that breakdown with truth where he finds that it's no longer true. But then there's that breakthrough because now you're on that search for truth again. So if there's any last comments, I think
I do have something quick I want to say, which is just a shout out to Javier's channel for anyone who hasn't paid attention to Javier's channel. Javier's work has been fantastic. I've been following his video essays for well over a year now, and what sticks out to me in Javier's work is just the authenticity and the integrity of his thinking, because his thinking is constantly in touch with the intimacy of what's going on in his real life. It's always fresh. And it's just an honor to have known you, Javier, and I really appreciate the space that you hold here, and just want to encourage you to keep on pushing in this direction, because it's inspiring for me as well. And thank you for holding this space for us.
I second that.
I third that.
I third, fourth.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, I am, you know, just as thankful because I noticed that for those people that are watching, and so on, I want to say that I began this channel because I didn't know who I was, you know, but it's not a matter of searching, but sometimes it's just a matter of creating. That the interesting thing is that I started creating, and then I started realizing that people started seeing me from what I couldn't see, like Daniel's little crisis that he had when he was 3, right? I can't see myself unless I have a mirror. and so this aspect of like the people that have been attracted to this channel, and the people that I've been attracted to, and they've been attracted to me, we have both played as mirrors for each other. So I'm always thankful for that, very thankful for that. And so for the audience out there, I am, you know, I'm going to conclude it. And I hope that you guys will stay tuned for the next episode. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about. I think there's hints about how to die the right way, technology, literature, art. Yeah. So
We'll have maybe the theme song to go out on is maybe.
I don't have long enough hair to do the hair whip.
One more
I wanna do
time.
the hair whip.
I said I'm sorry, Mama. I never meant to make you cry.
I'm going to negate you into something.
Okay, I like it. I think that's exactly how I'm
I
gonna cut
tried to
this.
make you concrete and you were an obstruction. I'm so sorry. Autonomous rationality, baby. Oh,
See, I
please
think
love
Daniel
me.
is gonna have a rap album.
Yo, I'm gonna be
We're
like,
so close.
concrete me.
We're so close.
It's gonna be called concrete
We're so
me.
close to a Daniel rap album.
Okay.
Yo, autonomous rationality, no.
You saw the track list, Daniel. It's all set.
It's all set.
We got
Boom.
it for you.
We said we got the album cover. We set, man. It's beautiful. Well, Javier, this has been magnificent. Raven, this has been an honor, pleasure. Cadell, always magnificent. Davood, love all of you tremendously. Thank you. This has been great. Greatly look forward to the next one. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.